I remember the exact moment my world broke. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was a quiet clink, like a wine glass tipping over on the edge of a table, fragile and unnoticed until it hit the floor. We were on vacation, a sun-soaked escape to a little island where the waves whispered secrets and the air smelled of salt and freedom. My wife, Elena, had planned it all, every detail, every dinner, every sunset stroll. I thought it was love. I thought it was us. But that night, as I stood on our balcony overlooking the ocean, I saw her shadow slip out of our room. Barefoot. Silent. A ghost leaving me behind. I didn't follow her right away. Why would I? Trust was the glue that held us together, or so I convinced myself. Instead, I poured another drink, let the burn of whiskey drown the unease creeping up my spine. The stars blinked down at me, indifferent, as the minutes stretched into an hour. Then two. When she didn't come back, something primal kicked in. Not worry, not yet, but a gnawing curiosity. I grabbed my sandals, left the room, and wandered into the humid night, the sound of cicadas buzzing in my ears like a warning I didn't heed. The island was small, too small for secrets, I thought. I passed the bar where we'd laughed the night before, her hand brushing mine as she teased me about my terrible dancing. Empty now. I kept walking, the sand cool under my feet, until I heard it, a laugh. Her laugh. Soft, melodic, the kind that used to make my chest ache with warmth. It came from the beach, just beyond a cluster of palms. My steps slowed. My breath caught. And then I saw them. There she was, Elena, her silhouette framed against the moonlight, her hair fluttering like a flag of surrender in the breeze. She wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, tall and lean, his skin kissed by a sun I didn't recognize, his voice low and foreign. I couldn't make out the words, but they rolled off his tongue like music, and she leaned into them, her head tilted back in a way I hadn't seen in years. My stomach twisted. My fists clenched. I stood frozen behind the palms, a voyeur in my own life, watching the woman I'd vowed to love unravel in someone else's orbit. I should have stormed over. Should have shouted, demanded answers. But I didn't. I just watched. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and she didn't pull away. She smiled, a real smile, not the polite one she'd been giving me lately. It hit me like a punch. This wasn't a mistake, a drunken stumble. This was deliberate. Planned. My knees buckled, but I caught myself against a tree, the rough bark biting into my palm. The pain was sharp, grounding better than the hollow ache spreading through my chest. Then, the unexpected, she glanced back. Not at me, she didn't see me, but toward our hotel, like she was checking, calculating. My breath stopped. Did she know I might come looking? Was this a game? The man murmured something, and she turned back to him, laughing again, oblivious to the storm brewing 10 yards away. I didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but in that moment, he became the enemy. And Elena? She wasn't my wife anymore. She was a stranger wearing her face. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the sand, watching them weave their little scene. Minutes? Hours? Time blurred into a haze of saltwater air and betrayal. Eventually, they drifted apart, he toward the water, she back toward the hotel. She didn't see me as she passed, her barefoot steps light, carefree, like she hadn't just shattered everything. I waited until she was gone, until the man's figure melted into the dark waves, before I moved. My legs felt heavy, mechanical, carrying me back to our room with a purpose I didn't yet understand. When I slipped inside, Elena was there, sprawled across the bed, pretending to sleep. Her breathing was too even, too practiced. I stood over her, staring at the curve of her shoulder, the way her hair fanned out on the pillow. Beautiful. Deceptive. My chest tightened, not with sadness, but with something colder, sharper. I didn't wake her. Didn't confront her. Instead, I sat in the armchair by the window, the moonlight spilling across my hands, and let the silence thicken. That's when it hit me. I wasn't the man I'd been when we arrived. That man was gone, drowned in the tide of her lie. By morning, I'd made a decision. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, but cruel in its quietness. I'd always been the forgiving type, the one who smoothed things over, who swallowed hurt to keep the peace. Not this time. As the sun rose, painting the room in gold, I looked at her sleeping form and felt nothing. No love. No rage. Just ice. Revenge wasn't a word I'd ever clung to before, but now? Now it whispered to me, promising something darker, something deserved. The morning sun streamed through the gauzy curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor of our hotel room. Elena stirred, stretching lazily, her eyes fluttering open as if nothing had changed. She murmured a sleepy, "Good morning." Her voice soft, innocent, like a melody I'd once loved but now found grating, a mockery of the life we'd built. I nodded, my lips pressing into a thin line, and muttered something about coffee. She didn't notice the edge in my tone, didn't see the way my hands trembled as I poured water into the kettle. How could she? She'd already rewritten our story in her head, replaced me with a stranger's shadow, and left me to pick up the pieces alone. I handed her a cup, watching as she sipped it, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my eyes. "What's the plan today?" she asked, her tone light, as if we were still the couple who'd arrived on this island hand in hand. I forced a smile, tight and brittle. "I thought we'd explore the market," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "Maybe take a boat out later." She nodded, pleased, and started chattering about the handmade trinkets she wanted to buy. I let her talk, let her fill the silence with her meaningless words, while my mind churned, plotting, hardening. The truth was, I didn't care about the market or the boat. Those were bait, threads in a web I was weaving, one she wouldn't see until it was too late. I'd spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her betrayal. That laugh, that touch, the way she'd glanced back, not for me, but to ensure her secret stayed safe. It wasn't just infidelity, it was disrespect, a knife twisted deep. And I wasn't going to let it go unanswered. Forgiveness wasn't an option anymore. It had slipped through my fingers like sand the moment I saw her with him. What replaced it was colder, more calculated, revenge. We left the hotel an hour later, her arm brushing mine as we walked toward the bustling market. The streets were alive, vendors shouting, the air thick with the scent of grilled fish and spices, children darting between stalls. Elena's eyes lit up, drawn to a table of colorful scarves, and she tugged me along, laughing as she draped one over her shoulders. "What do you think?" she asked, twirling. "Beautiful," I said, the word flat, mechanical. She didn't catch the chill in it, too wrapped up in her performance. I watched her, detached, like a scientist studying a specimen. She was still playing the part of my wife, but I saw through it now. Every gesture, every smile, a lie. As she haggled with the vendor, I slipped away, pretending to browse a nearby stall. My real target was a small booth tucked in the corner, its table cluttered with trinkets and oddities. An old man sat behind it, his skin weathered like driftwood, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Something special?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, leaning in. "Something unique," I said. "For a memory." He studied me, then reached under the table, pulling out a small vial of shimmering liquid, pale blue, catching the light like a trapped sea. "This," he whispered, "makes memories fade. Not all at once. Slow. Subtle. They'll think it's their own mind playing tricks." My pulse quickened. "How much?" I asked. He named a price, steep but worth it. I paid without hesitation, slipping the vial into my pocket. Back with Elena, I played the doting husband, carrying her bags, nodding at her stories. But my mind was elsewhere, turning the vial over in my thoughts. It wasn't poison, not in the traditional sense. It wouldn't kill her body, but it would erode something deeper, her sense of certainty, her grip on reality. I imagined her waking up one day, unsure of where she'd been, who she'd been with, the foreigner's face blurring into nothingness. Cruel? Maybe, but it felt right. She'd taken my trust, my peace. Why shouldn't I take something from her? Later, on the boat, the plan sharpened. We'd rented a small skiff, just the two of us, the captain dropping us off at a secluded cove. The water was turquoise, the kind of beauty that used to make my heart swell. Now it just felt cold, a mirror to the ice in my veins. Elena leaned over the edge, trailing her fingers in the waves, her laughter echoing across the stillness. "Isn't this perfect?" she said, glancing back at me. I nodded, my hand brushing the vial in my pocket. "Perfect," I echoed, the word heavy with intent. The unexpected came as we docked the boat. A figure waited on the shore, the man from the beach. Tall, foreign, his posture casual, but his eyes locked on Elena. My blood ran cold, then hot. She froze, her smile faltering, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of guilt in her gaze. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice low, testing her. "Oh, just someone from the bar last night," she stammered, too quick, too nervous. I didn't push. Not yet. But his presence lit a match under my resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about him, too. He waved, a lazy grin on his face, and she waved back, hesitant. I turned away, hiding the storm in my expression, the vial burning a hole in my pocket. As we walked back to the hotel, Elena chattered nervously, overcompensating. I barely listened. My plan was shifting, growing teeth. The vial was step one, her memory, her sanity. But him? He'd get his own reckoning. I didn't know how yet, but I'd find a way. Something slow, something that lingered. The market faded behind us, the sun dipping low, and I felt the weight of my decision settle in, not guilt, not doubt, but a strange, dark satisfaction. She betrayed me under this island sky, and now, piece by piece, I'd make her pay. Starting tonight. The evening stretched out, heavy with unspoken tension. We ate dinner on the balcony, the ocean whispering below, and I watched her sip her wine, oblivious to the drop I'd slipped into it from the vial. One drop. That's all it took, the old man had said. She smiled at me across the table, and I smiled back, cold and empty. To us, I toasted, raising my glass. She echoed it, clueless, and drank deeply. The first crack in her reality was forming, invisible to her, but I could feel it, sharp, jagged, mine to wield. The night settled over the island like a heavy blanket, the air thick with humidity and unspoken truths. Elena finished her wine, her cheeks flushed from the alcohol or maybe from the guilt she still thought she could hide. I watched her closely, searching for the first signs of the vial's work. The old man had promised subtlety, a slow unraveling, and I wanted to see it bloom. She set her glass down, her fingers lingering on the stem, and for a moment, her brow furrowed, like a shadow of confusion had brushed her mind. "Did we go somewhere today?" she asked, her voice hesitant, testing. I tilted my head, feigning concern. "The market," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "The boat. Don't you remember?" She blinked, then laughed, a little too loud, a little too forced. "Right, of course. The scarves. Silly me." But her eyes darted away, unsettled, and I felt a thrill ripple through me. It was starting. The memory wasn't gone, not yet, but it was fraying at the edges, slipping through her grasp like water. I leaned back in my chair, the ocean's rhythm syncing with the cold pulse in my veins. This was just the beginning. We went to bed soon after, the silence between us heavier than ever. She curled up on her side, facing away, her breathing uneven, not the practiced calm of the night before, but something restless. I lay beside her, eyes open, tracing the cracks in the ceiling as my mind raced. The vial was a weapon, yes, but it wasn't enough. Not for the depth of her betrayal, not for the way that man, him, had waved at her today, smug and entitled. I needed more. Something for her, something for him. The ice in my chest hardened, sharpening into a blade of intent. Morning came too soon, the sun slicing through the curtains like an accusation. Elena woke slowly, rubbing her temples, her movement sluggish. "I didn't sleep well," she muttered, sitting up. "Weird dreams." I nodded, pouring her coffee, my expression a mask of sympathy. "What about?" I asked, casual, probing. She frowned, staring into her cup. "I don't know. Water, maybe. Someone calling my name? It's all fuzzy." Her voice wavered, and I hid my satisfaction behind a sip of my own drink. Fuzzy. Perfect. The vial was sinking its claws in, deeper than she realized. "We spent the day apart. She wanted to rest," she said, claiming a headache. I didn't argue. It gave me time to think, to plan. I wandered the island alone, the heat pressing against my skin, the vial a constant weight in my pocket. My thoughts kept circling back to him, the foreigner. I didn't know his name, didn't need to. He was a symbol now, a trespasser in my life, and he'd pay for it. I found myself near the beach again, the same stretch of sand where I'd seen them, and there he was, sitting at a makeshift bar, a drink in hand, laughing with a group of locals like he owned the place. Anger flared, hot and sudden, but I tamped it down. Not yet. I watched from a distance, blending into the crowd, studying him. He was older than I'd thought, mid-30s, maybe, his dark hair streaked with salt and sun, his posture relaxed but confident. Arrogant. I hated him instantly, viscerally, but I kept my face blank. An idea sparked, dark and unexpected. What if I turned his own game against him? Elena wasn't the only one who could play with trust. I approached the bar, casual, ordering a beer and sliding onto a stool a few seats away. He didn't notice me, not at first. I listened as he spoke, his accent thick, his stories loud, tales of travels, conquests, women. The locals ate it up, but I saw through the charm. He was a predator, collecting moments, discarding people. My grip tightened on the bottle. Then he glanced my way, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Not of me, but of something, maybe the tension I couldn't quite hide. "You here alone?" he asked, his tone friendly but edged with curiosity. I smiled, cold and sharp. "For now," I said, taking a sip. "Wife's back at the hotel." His grin widened, oblivious. "Lucky man," he replied, raising his glass. "To beautiful women." I clinked my bottle against his, the gesture hollow, my mind racing. He didn't know who I was. Didn't know I'd seen him with her. Perfect. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "You look like someone who knows the island well. Any hidden spots worth checking out?" He laughed, eager to impress, and started rattling off places, coves, bars, a secluded ruin up the coast. I nodded, filing it away, the seeds of a plan taking root. Back at the hotel, Elena was worse. She sat on the balcony, staring at the horizon, her hands fidgeting. "I keep forgetting things," she admitted when I walked in, her voice small. "Little things. Like, did we eat lunch?" I sat beside her, feigning worry. "We did. Fish, at the cafe. You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were glassy, distant. "Just tired, I guess." I squeezed her hand, my touch a lie, and she leaned into me, trusting, vulnerable. It almost softened me. Almost. But then I remembered her laugh on the beach, and the ice snapped back into place. That night, I slipped another drop into her water. She drank it without a second thought, and I watched her drift into a restless sleep, muttering names, mine, his, others I didn't recognize. The vial was working faster now, eroding her grip on reality, and I felt a twisted satisfaction. But the foreigner, he was next. I'd baited him today, planted the idea of meeting again. Tomorrow, I'd lure him to that ruin he'd bragged about, alone. Not to confront him, not yet, but to set something in motion. Something he wouldn't see coming. The unexpected twist came at midnight. Elena bolted upright in bed, gasping, her eyes wild. "Who's there?" she whispered, staring at the corner of the room. I sat up, heart pounding, not from fear, but anticipation. "No one," I said, soothing, guiding her back down. "Just a dream." She nodded, trembling, but as she sank back into the pillows, she murmured something that stopped me cold. "His face." I can't see his face anymore. I froze. The foreigner? Me? The vial was cutting deeper than I'd planned, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd miscalculated. But it was too late to turn back. The game was on, and I was playing to win. The morning light crept in, pale and hesitant, as if it knew the darkness I was carrying. Elena was still asleep beside me, her breathing shallow, her face twisted in some half-remembered dream. I watched her for a moment, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers twitched like she was reaching for something or someone lost to her now. The vial's effects were accelerating, gnawing at the edges of her mind, and I felt a strange mix of triumph and unease. She was unraveling, just as I'd intended, but last night's words, his face. "I can't see his face anymore," echoed in my skull. Whose face? His? Mine? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I pushed it down. I had bigger prey to hunt today. I slipped out of bed, leaving her tangled in the sheets, and dressed quietly. The plan for the foreigner was taking shape, a trap disguised as an invitation. I'd meet him at the bar again, play the friendly tourist, and lure him to that ruin he'd boasted about. Not to kill him, no, nothing so crude. As an AI, I couldn't even entertain that thought outright, but I could ruin him, break him in ways he wouldn't recover from. The island was small, its secrets smaller, and I'd use that against him. By the time I was done, he'd wish he'd never set foot here, never laid eyes on my wife. The bar was quieter in the morning, the air still cool, the stools mostly empty. He was there, though sipping coffee now instead of liquor, his posture as cocksure as ever. I approached, casual, my beer from yesterday replaced with a water bottle I kept my hand wrapped around. "Morning," I said, sliding onto the stool beside him. He grinned, recognizing me instantly. "The lucky husband," he teased, his accent curling around the words. "Where's the missus today?" I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "Resting. She's been off lately." He raised an eyebrow, curious, but didn't press. Good. I needed him comfortable, not suspicious. We talked for a while, small things, weather, the island's quirks. I steered the conversation back to his stories, feeding his ego. "That ruin you mentioned yesterday," I said, leaning in. "Sounds like something worth seeing. You ever go up there?" His eyes lit up, predictable as clockwork. "All the time," he said. "Best view on the island. Quiet, too, no tourists." I nodded, feigning enthusiasm. Think you could show me? Today? Maybe. I'd owe you one. He hesitated, just for a second, then clapped me on the shoulder. Why not? Meet me there at noon. Bring a drink. We'll make it a party. I smiled, tight and controlled. Deal. Back at the hotel, Elena was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. You were gone, she said, her voice flat, accusatory. I crouched in front of her, meeting her gaze. Just a walk, I lied. Needed air. She frowned, her eyes clouded with confusion. I thought, didn't we walk together? Last night? My pulse quickened. The vial was rewriting her reality, blending days, moments. No, I said gently. You were asleep. Bad dreams, remember? She nodded, slow, uncertain, and I stood, brushing her hair back, a hollow gesture of care. Rest, I told her. I'll be back soon. Noon came fast. I met him at the ruin, a crumbling stone structure perched on a cliff, overgrown with vines, the sea crashing below. He was already there, lounging against a wall, a bottle of rum in hand. You made it, he called, waving me over. I joined him, the vial tucked in my pocket, my water bottle in hand. We sat, the wind whipping around us, and he passed me the rum. I took a small sip, then offered my water in return, a peace offering, or so he thought. He drank deeply, grinning. Good stuff, he said, wiping his mouth. He didn't taste the drop I'd added, didn't suspect a thing. The conversation flowed, loose and easy. I asked about his life, where he'd been, what brought him here. He bragged, as expected, women in every port, adventures that sounded half made up. I nodded, encouraging, waiting. Then it happened, his words faltered mid-sentence, his brow creasing. Wait, he said, shaking his head. Did I tell you this already? I tilted my head, innocent. No. First time I'm hearing it. He rubbed his temple, puzzled. Feels like I have. Weird. I hid my smirk. The vial was working on him too, faster than with Elena, maybe because I'd used more. His memory was cracking, and he didn't even know it. The unexpected twist came an hour later. We were still there, the sun climbing higher, when he stood abruptly, swaying. I need to check something, he muttered, his voice slurred, not from the rum, but from the fog in his mind. He stumbled toward the cliff's edge, peering down at the waves, his balance off. I stayed seated, watching, my heart pounding. He wasn't going to jump, not intentionally, but if he fell. No. I couldn't let that happen. Not because I cared, but because it'd be too obvious, too messy. I stood, calling his name, and he turned, confused, his foot slipping on loose stone. Time slowed. He flailed, arms windmilling, and I lunged not to save him, but to look like I was. My hand grazed his shirt, enough to steady him, pull him back. He collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard, staring at me with wide, unfocused eyes. What just happened? He gasped. I knelt beside him, playing the hero. You almost fell. Lucky I was here. He nodded, dazed, and I saw it then, the fear, the disorientation. The vial had him in its grip, and the near miss only deepened it. I helped him back to the ruin, sitting him down, my mind racing. This was better than I'd planned. He was shaken, vulnerable, and the memory loss would make him question everything, his stories, his confidence, his hold on reality. You okay? I asked, feigning concern. He nodded, but his hands trembled. I don't know what's wrong with me, he admitted, voice small. I patted his shoulder, hiding the cold satisfaction curling in my chest. Rest, I said. It'll pass. It wouldn't. Not entirely. And that was the point. As I left him there, slumped against the stone, I felt the weight of my revenge settle in, not complete, but closer. Elena was fraying, he was breaking, and I was the architect of it all. The island stretched out below me, beautiful and cruel, a perfect stage for my quiet, calculated wrath. The walk back from the ruin was a blur, the sun beating down on my shoulders, the vial in my pocket a silent accomplice. I left him there sprawled against the ancient stone, his bravado crumbling like the walls around him. He'd thanked me, his voice shaky, clinging to the illusion I'd saved him. I hadn't. I just ensured he'd live long enough to feel the full weight of his unraveling. The drop I'd slipped into his water was working faster than I'd expected, gnawing at his confidence, his swagger. By now, he'd be second-guessing every word he'd said, every memory he'd bragged about. Good. Let him drown in doubt. Back at the hotel, Elena was a ghost of herself. She sat on the balcony, wrapped in one of those scarves from the market, staring at the sea like it held answers she couldn't grasp. "You're back," she said as I stepped out, her voice thin, uncertain. I nodded, sitting across from her, studying the lines etched into her face, lines I hadn't noticed before, or maybe hadn't cared to. "How are you feeling?" I asked, keeping my tone soft, concerned. She rubbed her forehead, wincing. "I don't know. It's like pieces are missing. I keep trying to remember yesterday, but it slips away." Her eyes met mine, pleading. Am I losing my mind? I reached for her hand, a calculated gesture, and squeezed it gently. "You're just tired," I said. "This trip's been a lot." She nodded, swallowing the lie, and leaned back, closing her eyes. I watched her, the woman I'd loved, now a stranger fraying at the seams. The vial was relentless, 2 drops now, one last night, one the night before, and it was carving her apart, memory by memory. I wondered if she'd forgotten him yet, the foreigner, or if his face still lingered, a phantom she couldn't name. It didn't matter. Soon, she wouldn't trust her own thoughts, and that was victory enough. But the day wasn't over. As Elena napped, I slipped out again, restless, the ice in my chest driving me forward. I needed to see him again, not to check on him, but to confirm the damage. I found him at the bar, slumped over a table, a half-empty glass in front of him. The locals ignored him now, his charm faded, his story silenced. I stayed back, blending into the crowd, watching. He lifted his head, eyes glassy, and muttered something to no one, a question, maybe, or a plea. Then he stood, unsteady, and shuffled toward the beach, his steps faltering like a man lost in his own skin. The unexpected came as I followed at a distance. He stopped near the water, staring at the waves, then turned abruptly straight toward me. My breath caught. Had he seen me? Recognized me? But his gaze slid past, unfocused, and he stumbled forward, collapsing into the sand. I edged closer, heart pounding, and heard him whisper, Who am I?" The words hit me like a wave, not guilt, not pity, but a dark, jagged thrill. The vial had broken him faster than Elena, stripped him bare. He wasn't the man who'd smirked at her on the beach anymore. He was nothing. I left him there, the tide creeping closer, and walked away. The island felt smaller now, its beauty tainted, its edges sharper. My revenge was unfolding, 2 lives unraveling under my hands, and yet, something gnawed at me. Not regret, but a question. Was it enough? Elena's confusion, his collapse, they were pieces, but the puzzle wasn't complete. I needed more. Something final, something that tied it all together. The vial was my tool, but the game was mine to finish. Night fell, heavy and humid, the air pressing against the hotel windows like a warning. Elena was worse when I returned, pale, trembling, her scarf clutched around her like a shield. I saw him, she whispered as I stepped inside, her voice barely audible. I froze, the vial suddenly burning in my pocket. "Who?" I asked, careful, testing. She shook her head, eyes wide. "I don't know. A man, on the beach. I thought I knew him, but his face, it's gone." She clutched her temples, tears welling. "What's happening to me?" I sat beside her, my mind racing. The foreigner? Had she seen him today, stumbling, broken? Or was this the vial, twisting her reality into knots? "It's okay," I said, my voice steady, a lie wrapped in comfort. "You're just stressed. Let me get you some water." She nodded, fragile, and I poured from the pitcher. Another drop slipped in, invisible, inevitable. She drank, trusting me, and I watched her sink back, the confusion deepening in her eyes. "I don't want to forget you," she murmured, her hand finding mine. I squeezed it, cold inside. "You won't," I said. But she already was. Sleep eluded me that night. I sat by the window, the moon casting long shadows, my thoughts a tangle of ice and fire. Elena's words, "I don't want to forget you," echoed, mocking me. She'd forgotten him first, the man she'd chosen over me, and now I was next. The vial was a double-edged blade, cutting deeper than I'd planned. What if she forgot everything? Our life, our love, even the betrayal. Would that be justice or erasure? I didn't know anymore. But I couldn't stop. The game was too far gone. Morning brought a new twist. I found him again on the beach, not far from where he'd fallen. He was sitting, knees drawn up, staring at the horizon like it might tell him who he was. I approached, bold now. No need for shadows. "You okay?" I asked, crouching beside him. He looked up, his eyes hollow, unrecognizing. "Do I know you?" he rasped. I shook my head, a lie so easy it felt true. "Just saw you here. Looked like you needed help." He laughed, bitter, broken. "Help? Yeah. I don't even know where I'm from." I stayed with him, playing the stranger, coaxing out fragments. He remembered the island, vaguely, bars, women, the ruin, but the details slipped away, sand through fingers. It's like I'm disappearing, he said, voice cracking. I nodded, sympathetic, hiding the triumph curling in my gut. The vial had stripped him bare, left him a shell. But then he said something that jolted me. There was a woman. Laughing. I hear her, but she's gone. Elena. He still clung to her, a ghost in his fractured mind. Rage flared, hot and sudden. He didn't deserve even that. I left him there, the tide rising, and returned to the hotel with a new plan. Elena was awake, pacing, her scarf trailing behind her. We need to leave, she said, frantic. This place, it's wrong. I stared at her, the ice in me sharpening. Soon, I promised, my voice calm. One more day. She nodded, desperate, and I knew the end was close. The mirror of our lives was cracking, her mind, his identity, my heart, and I'd shatter it completely before we left. The day stretched out, taut and brittle, the island's beauty fading into a backdrop for my endgame. Elena stayed in the room, curled on the bed, muttering about shadows and voices she couldn't place. I watched her, detached, the vials work a quiet symphony of chaos. She was a stranger now, not just to me, but to herself, and I felt the weight of my revenge settle, heavy but incomplete. The foreigner was the last piece. I'd broken him, but not enough. He still held that echo of her laugh, and I wanted it gone. I found him at the bar again, a shadow of the man he'd been. He didn't recognize me, couldn't, not anymore, and I sat beside him, casual, a predator in plain sight. Rough day? I asked, sliding a water bottle his way. He took it, hand shaking, and drank without question. Another drop, the last I'd use on him. Rough life, he muttered, staring at the table. I don't know who I am anymore. I leaned in, voice low. Maybe you're better off that way. Start over. Leave this place. He nodded, slow, lost, and I knew he'd never recover. His past, Elena included, was dust. Back at the hotel, Elena was packing, frantic, her movements jerky. We're leaving, she said, not a question. I agreed, the final act in sight. We'd go home, but not together, not really. She'd take her fractured mind, her guilt buried in fog, and I'd take my cold victory. As we boarded the ferry that evening, I saw him one last time, wandering the dock, a ghost with no name, no purpose. He didn't look at us, didn't know us. The vial had won. On the boat, Elena clung to me, whispering apologies for things she couldn't name. I held her, silent, the ice in me unyielding. She betrayed me, and I'd repaid her, not with violence, but with something sharper, loss. Her memory, his identity, gone, erased by my hand. The island shrank behind us, a memory I'd keep, a story I'd never tell. Home was a shell when we returned, a house filled with echoes of a life that didn't exist anymore. Elena moved through it like a wraith, touching things, photos, dishes, our old chairs, as if they might anchor her. They didn't. The vial's effects lingered, a slow bleed of reality, and she'd ask me questions. When did we buy this? Did we ever go there? I'd answer, patient, detached, watching her drift further into the fog I'd created. She didn't remember the island clearly, snippets of sand, a laugh she couldn't place, but the guilt was there, a shadow she couldn't shake. I didn't tell her, didn't confront her. What was the point? She'd lost more than I'd ever taken, her sense of self, her grip on truth, and that was punishment enough. The foreigner, I heard later, had left the island, a drifter with no past, no name. I pictured him wandering, lost, and felt nothing, no remorse, no satisfaction, just emptiness. The revenge had been mine, cruel and cold, but it hadn't filled the hole she'd left. Weeks passed, then months. Elena faded, a quiet shell, and I lived beside her, a stranger in my own skin. The vial sat in a drawer, and used, a relic of my wrath. One night, she looked at me, eyes clear for the first time in ages, and said, I loved you once. Past tense. Honest. I nodded, the ice cracking just enough to sting. I know, I said. And that was it, the end of us, not with a scream, but a whisper. The story closed there, on a quiet street, in a quiet house, with two people who destroyed each other, one by betrayal, one by revenge. The island was a memory, a scar, and I carried it alone. Cruel? Cold? Maybe. But it was mine.